Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Is India's obsession with GDP growth mistaken and misleading because it hides, or at least it doesn't reveal, the real truth about the economy and the conditions in which the Indian people live? That's the belief of my guest today, and joining me now to explain why he's come to that conclusion is the Congress Party's chairman of data analytics, Praveen Chakravarty. Praveen Chakravarty, in a recent op-ed that you wrote for the Indian Express, you say, and I'm quoting, headline GDP is a dangerously misleading odometer for the economic engine of a nation. In other words, headline GDP does not tell you the true condition in which the majority of people live. You can have high GDP growth, but also at the same time, worryingly high unemployment and tens of millions dependent on NREGA. Have I understood you correctly?
Yes, thank you, Karan, for having me. Yes, I was in that article that you're referring to, I was pointing out the dissonance between economic growth measured in GDP terms and livelihoods of people. What I did was I used two sets of government's own data, which is the GDP data and data that comes from the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, where people go and demand for work when they have no other options. And using these two sets of data, I showed that while on one hand, we seem to be claiming that the GDP, India is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, we also have tens of millions of families pleading for work under the NREGA scheme, essentially saying that we don't have any other option. So this is the dissonance that I was pointing to. And I was making the argument of what use is economic growth if it is not going to benefit the army or the average person. After all, we live in a society, not in an economy, don't we?
Absolutely. Now, two things follow from what you've written. First, and this may be a little incidental or tangential, but nonetheless, I'll bring it up. The debate that's been at the forefront of the media between four former chief economic advisors, three foreign university academics, and members of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council over India's actual GDP growth for the last quarter and whether it's strong or whether it's anemic, that is irrelevant because GDP doesn't convey the real truth of what is happening in the country. This is an academic debate, not one that actually has pertinence or relevance to the people of the country.
Yes, because there was a lot of debate among many people from all sides of the spectrum, but largely economists and academicians and bureaucrats agonizing over how we measure GDP. And I was trying to raise the question, why are we missing the forest for the trees here? Why are we agonizing over the minutiae of how GDP is measured when we should be actually asking the question, what GDP are we measuring? Who is it benefiting? And here I must actually point out, speaking of economists and experts, I must point out that there is a recent interview of a 99-year-old Nobel economist called Robert Solow. He is the father of economic growth. He won a Nobel for his economic growth model. And in the recent interview, he says GDP was never intended to be a holistic measure of the economic health of a nation. So this is Robert Solow himself talking about this. So my question was, why are all these brilliant brains discussing inane GDP measurement when surely we could be using those brains for something more important?
I'd underline for the audience the importance of what you said. Robert Solow, who is the man who first devised how GDP should be calculated and won a Nobel Prize for doing so, has now gone on record to say that the GDP or GDP growth must not be taken as an indicator of the health of the economy. It is one of many measures, but not necessarily the distinctive or the most important one.
And in fact, he goes on to say that the relationship between livelihoods and prosperity for people and GDP growth is actually broken. He says that on record in this interview.
Now, your second point in that article for the Indian Express is, in a sense, much the more important point. You say India's Q1 GDP growth of 7.8% more or less coincided with the highest ever demand during the last 10 years for NREGA in June, July, and August. And it also coincided with an unemployment rate hovering around 8%. So this means in India's case, impressive GDP growth can happen alongside very distressing unemployment and economic distress, which is also happening at the same time. Both are happening together, but if you only focus on the GDP growth, you miss the reality of the distress of unemployment and of people having to survive on NREGA.
Correct. See, for that, we have to first understand what's the NREGA program. The NREGA program was designed where people could go and demand work for bare minimum wages by toiling in the sun all day if they did not have any other means of incomes or jobs. Right? So it is a demand-based program. So when people go and demand, that is a signal that tells us something, that tells us that they do not have any other options. So it is only desperate people in distress are pushed to go ask for NREGA work. And I'm using the government's own data. And I'm asking the question, why is it that 20 million families asked for NREGA work in the month of August? 23 million families asked for NREGA work in the month of July. 33 million families asked for NREGA work in the month of June, exactly when our GDP was apparently growing at the fastest pace in the world. So surely there's a big gap here, and we should be focusing on 20 million families demanding this, not on some 7.2% or 8.4% headline GDP growth.
I'll point out for the audience, although hopefully it's not necessary, that there's a huge difference between NREGA and unemployment benefit as recognized in the West, particularly in countries like England. There you get unemployment benefit if you don't have a job, simply sitting at home. But NREGA actually means you have to do back-breaking, hard physical work in the sun, and it is not an easy option and certainly not something that people go to as a way out of working. It is extremely hard work in the sun and therefore pretty close to back-breaking. Am I right in making that distinction?
Absolutely. And that is why, even though the scheme is called employment guarantee, it's actually an unemployment insurance scheme. But because the designers of the scheme wanted to make sure that people do not misuse it, they wanted the threshold for this demand to be very, very high. So which means people have to go and toil in the sun and for absolutely bare minimum wages. They only pay very bare minimum wages.
Which means they have to be absolutely on the skids to want to take up NREGA. That is an illustration of the distress they face.
That is correct.
Now, let's drill a little further into your second point. As you pointed out a moment ago, in August, 20 million families were dependent on NREGA. This means, as you put it, millions of families are signaling that as recently as a few weeks ago, they had no other source of income except to toil for bare minimum wages under the NREGA unemployment insurance scheme. And as you say, it is an indicator of the economic distress of Indian households. And I'll add for the audience that 20 million families means actually 100 million people, because it's 5 persons per family in the Indian assumption. And this has happened, as you pointed out, just when India's economy apparently experienced one of its strongest growth quarters, 7.8%. This is why you believe a single-minded focus on GDP growth is mistaken and misleading. It is hiding, or at least it's not revealing, what is happening to those in distress. So those who judge the performance of the economy in India just by the GDP figure are either accidentally, and that's being kind, or deliberately ignoring what is happening to a vast number of people. And that is why you think it's misleading.
That is correct. And I will give you one more piece of data, which I did not quote in the Indian Express article, but this is the Reserve Bank of India data. And this is to show how the relationship between headline GDP growth and jobs, as we know it, jobs being created, the relationship has been declining over time. This is Reserve Bank of India data. In the 1980 to 1990 decade, every 1% of nominal GDP growth created 2 lakh public sector and organized formal sector jobs. There could be many more informal sector jobs, but every 1% created 2 lakh organized jobs. In the subsequent decade from 1990 to 2000, every 1% of nominal GDP growth created only 1 lakh jobs. In the subsequent decade from 2000 to 2010, it created only 50,000 jobs. It was halving every decade, and now it is even lower. So there is a very clear trend that the relationship between GDP and formal sector job creation is going down pretty dramatically. And we could soon reach a point where we could have very high GDP growth, but actually create no real jobs at all.
This underlines your argument very emphatically, because if I can coin a phrase, the so-called pull-up factor of GDP growth is actually diminishing decade by decade. And we could reach a point where high growth can happen without creating almost any jobs at all.
Absolutely. And this is fascinating data. This is the Reserve Bank of India's data. So, and you can see this plays out very, very clearly in the data. And so that is why I decided to make the argument that let us move away from the focus on GDP or headline GDP as a measure of economic prosperity.
Now, there's one further point about GDP. You don't make it in your article, but let me see if you agree with it. GDP uses a proxy to estimate what's happening in the unorganized sector, which is 45% of the economy if you include agriculture, 80 to 85% of employment. So first of all, we're not sure if the unorganized sector is actually being measured correctly. We're relying on a proxy to do so. But secondly, if the unorganized sector is disproportionately hit by COVID, as many believe was the case, compared to the organized sector, the proxy which is derived from the organized sector will very substantially overestimate the unorganized sector. And that, again, is another reason for saying the outcome in terms of GDP growth is misleading.
Yes, I'm going to answer this more as a political economist right now in my capacity. And I actually disagree with this argument. I don't agree. And I know I've heard this for some time, the informal sector, the vast informal sector of India's economy. But in my view, that is not why GDP is misleading. And I'll tell you why. Even if people are, a vast majority of our people are employed in the informal sector, they are still earning. When they earn, they spend that money. When they spend that money, that creates economic activity. And that economic activity is captured in GDP statistics, either on the consumption side or on the production side. So in our NREGA example, if 100 million people are getting bare minimum wages for toiling under NREGA, they're still getting that money, and they're presumably using that money to spend on basic needs, which then gets captured in GDP statistics. So the informal formal sector distinction matters for taxation and tax revenues to the government, not so much for GDP statistics as a whole, because GDP captures overall economic activity in a country.
I'll accept what you said completely because I'm not an economist, but I'll point out to the audience that the former chief statistician Pranab Sen has made this point several times in interviews he's given to me. And he wasn't talking about estimating GDP itself. i.e. in absolute terms, he was talking about estimating GDP growth. Because if the unorganized sector has been disproportionately hit, then the proxy that you use to estimate growth in the unorganized sector may be overestimating unorganized sector growth. That was the point he's making, but I'd accept what you said.
No, that is a fair point, because if suddenly there's a dramatic shift in share between formal and informal sector, so then that could lead to growth estimates being somewhat skewed. And I think that is a fair point. The point I'm making is overall GDP, when we measure economic activity, that does get captured.
So we're not actually disagreeing, because I wasn't talking about the measurement of overall GDP. I was talking and quoting Pranab Sen in terms of estimating growth in GDP in the unorganized sector, and there we are in agreement. Now, you come to two broad but important conclusions in your Indian Express article. First, you say the idea of GDP as a holy grail measure for the health of the overall economy is misleading and meaningless. That was my introduction. You've now explained why you've come to that conclusion, but am I right in saying that is in fact your conclusion?
Yes, absolutely. I think this maniacal obsession with headline GDP is faulty, is misleading, and it's dangerous. And I think that is why, and that is the main argument in my article.
Now, your second conclusion is actually a message to the opposition bloc called India. You say, and I'm quoting you, instead of nitpicking on GDP numbers as they normally do, the opposition India alliance can start by rejecting next quarter's GDP release and instead demand data on median income growth and the total number of jobs created in the economy. This, I presume, would be a way of talking about what matters to the vast majority of Indian people. GDP doesn't reflect the reality of their lives. This clearly would.
Yes, I am actually calling for a complete reset of economic discourse in the country. And I believe the onus of this lies with political parties and political leaders, starting with the opposition, including my own party. And that is why I said that instead of nitpicking and arguing over your GDP is worse than my GDP or my GDP is better than your GDP, it's the responsibility of the opposition to ask the question, whose GDP is this? Why we should be talking about people's GDP, and this is not people's GDP. So we need to have a complete reset in economic discourse, and that responsibility primarily lies with the opposition India Alliance. And that is why I called upon the India Alliance, at least communications people, to make a beginning.
Let me just pick up on that rhetorical question, whose GDP is this? Behind that lies your belief that the GDP figure is a reflection of what's happening to a small class of industry, a small class of workers in the organized sector. It is avoiding or not recognizing or hiding what is happening to 100 or 200 million people who are poor, who are unemployed, who are living on NREGA. That's why you asked the question, whose GDP is it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I will give you again some data and statistics. Last year, more than 100 million people survived on NREGA. To put that in context, if you take all the employees employed by all the 5,000 companies on the stock exchanges, these are the organized sector, they are 8 million people, 8 to 10 million people. 10 times more people are suffering, are in distress, and are asking for, begging for NREGA work. But GDP and GDP growth matters primarily to these 8 to 10 million people, not to the 100 million people. That's the scale of difference that we're talking about. And that's why I asked the question, whose GDP is this anyway?
Now tell me, have you discussed the advice that you articulated for India in your Indian Express article with Rahul Gandhi or with Mallikarjun Kharge? And if you have, what was their response?
So I didn't discuss it before I wrote the article, but I will tell you, yes, Mr. Rahul Gandhi called me after reading the article, and he asked me some questions in detail, and especially around the relationship between GDP and jobs. And I mean, these are economic issues of the common person does interest him a lot, and he does get into details. So I did discuss this with Mr. Gandhi. So since he read the article, clearly the article as the advice, or at least my idea for what the opposition alliance should do. And so I presume that he read that too.
Do you think that he is willing to follow your advice and move the focus away from GDP and talk instead about median income growth and total number of jobs created in the country?
I can't speak for what he will do or what he will not do, but he seemed intrigued enough by my article to call me and discuss it in great detail.
Now, you actually go one step further. You also have, and I think you hinted at this in one of your answers earlier, a general message for those who write about or claim to understand the economy. You say, and I'm quoting you, it is time for a complete reset in our economic public discourse and narrative. The health of the labor markets has to shape the economic narrative of the nation. In other words, it's how many jobs we're creating, or how many people are unemployed, or how many people are forced to use NREGA to survive, that should be the narrative of the economic behavior of the country, rather than this narrow, single-minded, as you call it, maniacal and faulty focus on GDP.
Yes, I'll give you a recent example, Karan. There was a report called The State of Working India that was released, I think, 10 days ago. That had lots of information about the labor market, about jobs, about the labor force, about the caste impact and discrimination in the labor force, age discrimination, gender discrimination, all of this. Did you hear as much attention on this report as we did on how India is the world's fastest growing economy measured in GDP terms? We did not. So that is my simple point. My simple point is, this is what matters. When we talk about economy, we should be talking about the median Indian's economic well-being, not some headline GDP growth. And that is reflected through labor market information. And hence, I'm calling for a shift in focus from headline GDP to labor market information, as economists would call it.
A thought occurs to me as you were speaking. India has, of course, for a decade or longer, been focused on GDP growth. That was also true of the Manmohan Singh government. But this boastful claim, and I'm not saying it's inaccurate, but the claim, which is enhanced by the government and the PM in particular, that India is now the fastest growing big economy, that is very much a Modi twist to the GDP narrative.
Yes. You may recall it was Dr. Manmohan Singh who coined the phrase inclusive growth. So I think the focus on GDP is not just in the last 10 years or 15 years. I think it goes back since the Washington Consensus took hold, really around the 1990s, around the time the Soviet Union collapsed. And it is since then that the idea of headline GDP as being given the primacy that it is took hold. But then I want to make it very clear, this is not a political argument that I'm making. In fact, I am making an argument in the national interest. I think it has to be a bipartisan project, which is why I called upon the alliance to shift the discourse. This is not a judgment on the current government's management of the economy. I think this is a situation where not just India, but it's actually a world's problem.
Absolutely. You're not criticizing, although you maybe have criticisms of the government's handling, but in your article and in this interview, you're not criticizing the way the Modi government has handled the economy. What you're doing is pointing out that the national obsession, enhanced in a sense by Mr. Modi's boast that we're the fastest growing economy in the world, with GDP growth single-mindedly, is mistaken and misleading because it ignores the distress, it ignores the miserable nature of the lives of up to 100, maybe even 200 million people. And that's what you're saying. You're not criticizing the handling of the economy, but you're saying you must learn to look at the economy through different measurements. And the measurement that's most appropriate is that which reflects the distress of the majority rather than the satisfaction and glow of success of a small number. Finally,
yes. In fact, I make this point in the article, the gloating of being the world's fastest growing economy. IMF executives coming to India and praising India as the fastest growing economy and pinning all these tags is actually a cruel joke on hundreds of millions of Indians.
Finally, and this is my last question, what you say about India is actually true for most of the rest of the world. You write, the correlation between headline GDP and prosperity for the median citizen has broken in most nations. In other words, there's a very real sense in which your advice applies not just to the India alliance, not just to people who talk about the economy, not just to people who get misled by the GDP growth figure. It applies across the board to people in all other countries as well.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a function of contemporary economic development models where the focus has been, the balance is skewed inordinately towards capital from labor, how we measure GDP, and the obsession with productivity has meant that the labor market has taken a big beating. And hence, I make the point that this is actually a global problem. And the point that I make is maybe it is time that we take seriously the 99-year-old father of economic growth, Robert Solow's words, which is, don't take GDP as seriously as you are doing right now.
Praveen Chakravarty, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.